Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to tell a story about Evelyn, a young woman I met from Molokai, which is a small rural island in the state of Hawaii. It's the kind of place that has one radio station, one high school, and everybody knows everybody. So, of course, everyone on Molokai knows Evelyn. And they were also very proud of her when she invented a pH sensor that could detect even small changes in the ocean's environment. Her device is nothing short of groundbreaking. It's actually more accurate than the devices that marine scientists at our federal agencies have been using, and it's way less expensive. It's an estimated 1/42nd of the price and requires half the maintenance. This invention makes Evelyn an accomplished scientist, an innovator, an entrepreneur, a passionate ocean steward. But she's also a junior in public high school, Molokai High School. She's proof that our public school students can compete and innovate at the highest levels, and that public schools can be a path to just about anything, which is why public schools and public education are to be held up and supported and understood as the great equalizer, the bedrock of our democracy, our civil society, our country. You can trace back the history of public education in America to the original 13 colonies. In 1635, boys in Boston could get a free education. And by 1647, the Massachusetts Bay Colony required every town to provide boys a basic education. Some 340 years later, our public education system has come a long way. But some things don't change. Our communities still understand how public education lays a foundation for success. It gives every American the chance to pursue their dreams. But the nominee for Secretary of Education doesn't seem to understand that, which is why we see constituents flooding the phone lines, Facebook and Twitter, faxes. I didn't know we still had faxes, but I found them in the office, and the inboxes of United States senators. In terms of pure volume, this last week has been the highest point for American interaction with the United States Congress in our history. Think about that. Think about what we've been through as a country together. And yet this week and last, more people have called their members of the Senate than literally ever before, because that's the level of passion that people feel for public education. And because Americans across the country are concerned, worried about what will happen to public education under Betsy DeVos. My office alone has received thousands of messages about her nomination, and I just want to be clear about this. There are certainly advocacy organizations that make it easy for you to contact your member of Congress. They have form letters, they have web forms, they make it easy, they populate the thing, they pop off an email, you just sort of sign at the bottom. This isn't what I'm talking about. These are organically generated individual letters from across the state of Hawaii, and talking with colleagues, that's what's happening. People are on their own calling because everybody has a story about public education. Everybody has a reason to be passionate about public education. And let me just share a few of these concerns. One from a parent on the Big Island of Hawaii. And I quote, "As a mother of two, and as a woman who went back to graduate school in her 50s, I understand the importance of free education in public schools as a fundamental American right, one which can create a lifelong love of education and learning." A constituent from Kihei, Maui, wrote, "Public schools are not failing. We, as in our American culture, are failing them." Another one from Kahului, Maui. "Children are not a business. They are not a commodity. Public education has its issues, of course it does, but privatizing teachers and turning education into an opportunity for the rich to get richer on one of the last social services we provide to everyone in this country is not the answer." Here's one from a teacher on the island of Molokai. The nominee for Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, has zero experience serving in public schools and is not qualified for the job. I do not believe she understands the needs of our students and what effort it has taken to move our schools as far along as we have. Public education is a great responsibility and cannot be left to those who have never worked directly with children in need. These are children who experience school as a safe place when they are valued, fed, and educated. This serious responsibility of public education in no way can be left or replaced by a voucher system. Here's another message from a constituent on the Big Island. My family has very strong ties to the education community, many of which are or were educators. My husband is an English teacher, English as a second language teacher, and my mother-in-law is currently a third grade teacher, so this issue is deep in our beliefs. We, at a minimum, deserve a leader with some experience and who knows at least some of the laws already in place as well as how to enforce them. Mrs. DeVos has never known what a child from Miloli'i has to do just to get a good education. She has never had to make the choice to go to college or to stay home, to try to save money while also helping to support her household. Neither her nor her children had to question if she can afford out-of-state tuition. She does not represent our plight, and she does not know our challenges. I ask you from the pureness of my heart, as a mom who wants what's best for not only my child, but for every mother's child, to please demand an educational representative with experience and our values in mind. And here's a message from another parent. This is not about which side of the political arena you fall upon. I believe there are many Republicans and Democrats who are far more qualified and knowledgeable than Mrs. DeVos. Our kids deserve better. And you know, my words now, she's right. Our kids do deserve better. But right now, not all of them are getting the education they deserve. A 2016 report found that 500,000 15-year-old students in the United States haven't mastered the basics in any subject, not math, not reading, not science. And more than 1 million scored below the baseline level in science. The U.S. News and World Report noted that if we could pull those kids up to a basic understanding, our economy could grow by an estimated $27 trillion over the time period that these students are in the workforce. And so set aside the human impact for a moment. Set aside the family impact. If all you care about is economic development, we are leaving $27 trillion on the table because we're not lifting every child up to learn as much as they possibly can and reach their potential. In too many places, we are failing these kids, and the impact is both negative and far-reaching. Our failure impacts their ability to go to college or learn a trade, to make a decent paycheck, to provide for their family, and to pursue the American dream. We don't have to fail these children. The Congress can make choices that will improve education for all. We can make, instead of break, the future for our kids. We can decide to increase funding for disadvantaged students. We can decide to protect our students from bullying, sexual harassment, and gun violence. We can decide to set up children for success with universal access to early childhood education. And there is abundant brain science now that confirms every parent's instinct, which is that the first 5 years of a child's life, of an infant's life into being a toddler and then to being a little kid, those first 5 years are the most important years for a child. And now we don't have to just use our instincts, because there is abundant brain science and data that has come in that has shown that in terms of the efficacy of a federal dollar spent, there is nothing that has a greater impact in terms of reducing social service spending, in terms of economic development, than investing in early childhood education. We can decide to adhere to common sense accountability standards to ensure a high-quality education for all children, regardless of who your parents are or where you live. We can decide to invest in wage-boosting apprenticeships and career and technical education. We can make college more affordable so that our students can access higher education without taking on crushing debt. But to accomplish these goals, we need an excellent Department of Education to make it happen, because the agency is responsible for implementing Congress's decisions. It's up to the executive branch to ensure equal access to education and to promote educational excellence throughout the nation. That is literally the mission statement of the U.S. DOE, to ensure equal access to education and to promote educational excellence. And that's the way I look at this secretary nominee. Is she committed to ensuring equal access to education and promoting educational excellence? The Secretary of Education is responsible for this mission, overseeing a $36 billion budget in K through 12 and about $150 billion in higher education funding. This person is responsible for enforcing key civil rights protections for our students. And this person advises the presidents on all things education in the United States, whether it's a policy that will affect a local public school or a policy that will impact millions of student borrowers. Up until this moment, every Secretary of Education who has served in the President's cabinet has had the resume required to take on these responsibilities. Shirley Hufstedler was the first Secretary of Education to be in the cabinet, serving under President Carter. As the daughter of a school teacher and a part-time teacher herself, she was also a trailblazing lawyer who was considered a favorite to be the first woman nominated to the Supreme Court. Terrell Bell was a teacher, a professor, and then a superintendent of a school district in Utah before he served under President Reagan. William Bennett was a professor at 3 universities who released research about higher education curriculums before heading the department to serve under President Reagan. Lauro Cavazos was dean of Tufts Medical School before becoming president of Texas Tech University. He would go on to be the first Secretary of Education for President George H.W. Bush. The esteemed Senator Alexander served as governor of Tennessee and president of the University of Tennessee before becoming President Bush's second Secretary of Education. Richard Riley championed funding and support for education as governor of South Carolina before leading the Department of Education under President Clinton. Rod Page was a professor, a dean, an innovator in education, and the superintendent of the Houston School District before he served under President George W. Bush. Margaret Spellings advised then-Governor George Bush on education in Texas before becoming his second Secretary of Education. Arne Duncan served as the CEO for Chicago's public school system before joining the Obama administration as Secretary of Education. And John King Jr. was the Commissioner of Education for New York and Deputy Secretary of Education before he led the department as Secretary for President Obama. And so every secretary who has led the department came to the job with a history in government or in the classroom. Every single one. They've served as elected officials or as policy advisors in the executive branch or worked as administrators or educators. But now, this administration is asking us to make an exception by confirming someone who really doesn't have any relevant experience. She's never served in the government, never taught in a classroom, never managed a school district. One woman from Oahu wrote me to say, quote, "She is supremely unqualified to lead the department." I further quote, "As a retired public school teacher, 30 years both in regular and special education, I am aghast that she is even being considered. When one is being nominated to uphold federal education laws and is confused by what IDEA entails, it becomes very apparent that this person is a poor choice for this position." Another letter I got from an educator reads, "I taught in both public and private schools for 10 years on the mainland before moving to Hawaii and teaching for more than 15 additional years. Watching video clips on the news of her Senate hearings, it is appalling to see how little she knows about the topic of education. I worry for all of our children. I worry for our country. Please, if you can, do what you can do to see that we get someone more qualified to help guide our children and our country. Help. Everything that's happened since Mrs. DeVos has been nominated has unfortunately only confirmed the concerns I heard from constituents. Because her hearing was so short, senators followed up with written questions, and in some cases, her responses lifted language from other sources without citing them. In one response, she wrote, quote, "Every child deserves to attend school in a safe, supportive environment where they can learn, thrive, and grow." Fine. Well, an Obama official used the exact same language in a press release regarding the rights of transgender students. But she did not cite that official or the press release. In another example, she answered a question about Title IX investigations in the following way. Opening a complaint for investigation in no way implies that the Office for Civil Rights has made a determination about the merits of that complaint. That's the exact language that the Department of Education uses in its own guidance. Now, there's nothing wrong with citing a source, especially when that source is the department that you want to run, but it has to be cited. That's one of the first things you teach a child in 7th and 8th grade when they're trying to learn how to do research and cite your sources. But the central issue isn't the lack of a seriousness of purpose during the hearings and in the questions for the record, although I think that was what caused the nation to kind of wake up and rise up about the challenge in front of us when it comes to public education. I mean, this was not part of some master strategy on the part of Democrats. What happened in those hearings is that Michael Bennet and Al Franken and Chris Murphy and Elizabeth Warren just did their jobs and asked questions. I mean, if you told me that a clip about the distinction between proficiency and growth, I mean, that's the wonkiest thing in the world. But what happened was 2 million people or more saw that on Facebook. This wasn't part of our political strategy. What happened was people saw the hearing and got really worried that we have the wrong person in charge of public education policy at the federal level. And so you have people left, right, and center. I mean, you can ask the Senate Republicans whether they're getting phone calls too. They're getting phone calls too. This is not a Democratic strategy. What's happening is we have the wrong person who may be confirmed as the Secretary of Education. The central issue is that there remain concerns around Ms. DeVos's basic understanding of education policy. During her confirmation hearings, there were several moments when she didn't seem to fully grasp important parts of federal law on education. The Washington Post actually published an article called 6 Astonishing Things Betsy DeVos Said and Refused to Say at her confirmation hearing. And I quote, "DeVos refused to agree with a Democrat that schools are no place for guns, citing one school that needs one to protect against grizzly bears. When Senator Chris Murphy asked her whether she would agree that guns don't belong in schools, she said, I will refer back to Senator Enzi and the school he was talking about in Wyoming. Quote, I think probably there, I would imagine that there is probably a gun in the schools to protect from potential grizzlies. This would be hilarious if it weren't so serious. This would be hysterically funny if this weren't the person that is about to become our Secretary of Education. When asked whether she would support President Trump if he has promised move to end gun-free zones around schools, she said, I will support whatever the president does. I will support whatever the president does, even if that means moving guns into schools, allowing guns in schools. She added, if the question is around gun violence and the results of that, please know that my heart bleeds and is broken for those families that have lost any individual to gun violence. DeVos refused to agree with Senator Tim Kaine that all schools that receive public federal funds, traditional, public, charter, or private schools that receive voucher money, should be held to the same standards of accountability. So a little background on this issue. I have a great charter school movement in the state of Hawaii, but the deal that we have struck, and it's imperfect, and they're always arguing about fixed costs and capital costs and all the rest of it. But the basic bargain when charters work is that they're legitimately a public school. So what does that mean? That means they're held to the same standards as traditional public schools, because to the extent that you have two categories of public schools with different metrics, then you're basically playing a game, trying to divert money from one to the other. Okay? And so Tim Kaine's question was exactly right. If public money is involved, whether it's voucher to a private school or school choice to a charter school or a traditional public school, shouldn't we measure each school's success in the same way, just to be fair? Kaine said, if confirmed, will you insist upon equal accountability in any K-12 school or educational program that receives taxpayer funding, whether public charter, or private? DeVos says, I support accountability. Kaine says, equal accountability? DeVos, I support accountability. Kaine, is that a yes or a no? DeVos, I support accountability. Kaine, do you not want to answer my question? DeVos, I support accountability. This is someone who either didn't prepare for the hearing or is basically walking into this hearing saying, I've got the votes. I don't have to answer your questions. I don't have to reassure the parents and teachers and students who are desperately worried about what's going to happen to public education because I've got the votes. Senator Kaine says, let me ask you this. I think all schools that receive taxpayer funding should be equally accountable. I mean, he's so polite, but he's also very lawyerly, so he asked the question 14 different ways, trying to get the answer. Do you agree? DeVos, well, they don't. They are not today. Kaine, well, I think they should. Do you agree with me? Well, no. Kaine, interrupting her, says, you don't agree with me. And then he moved on to another topic. DeVos appeared to have no idea what Al Franken was talking about when he referred to the accountability debate about whether to use test scores to measure student proficiency or student growth. Now, I mean, there is a debate about student proficiency and student growth, and I won't bore you with the details except to say I don't expect, regular folks out there to be into the weeds about the difference between proficiency and growth. I get how wonky that is. I absolutely expect the Secretary of Education nominee to know about this. I mean, even if you were brand new to the topic, if you just got smart people in the room who briefed you on it, 10 hours maybe, and you'd be ready to talk about proficiency and growth. This is what I am talking about when I talk about a lack of preparation, a lack of the humility around what advice and consent means. That the Senate has an obligation to take this, not to take every nomination seriously. Franken noted that the subject has been debated in the education community for many years and said, when she didn't weigh in and just looked at him without much of an expression on her face, it surprises me that you don't know this issue. But it isn't just issues like accountability or guns in schools that concern me. On a whole host of issues, Mrs. DeVos's views are far out of the mainstream of education policy. I want to highlight 4 policy areas where Mrs. DeVos's views are beyond my line in the sand. Let's start with K-12 education. I think we can all agree that this country has work to do when it comes to public education. But I'm worried that Mrs. DeVos would prefer to privatize our public schools instead of improving them. Take a look at her track record. She has fought to strip away protections around K-12 education and introduce a profit motive into our education system. She has lobbied for vouchers and for for-profit schools. She's been relatively successful in her lobbying efforts. In her home state of Michigan, she had an enormous influence on the state's approach to education. And I would point any senator on the fence about her nomination to look at this case study because it speaks volumes. In the year 2000, Michigan's 4th and 8th grade students had higher than average test scores in math and English. 15 years later, students now perform below average. Last spring, The Atlantic published a fascinating article about Detroit's education system, which has been most influenced by the policies that Mrs. DeVos champions. And I'd like to read a few excerpts from it. 3 months into her son's first pass at third grade, Arlissa Hurd had a breakdown. Judah was bright, but had begun calling himself stupid. The chaos of Detroit's precarious education landscape had forced him to switch schools every few months, leaving him further and further behind. There was no central system to transfer Judah's records when he moved, and according to Hurd, the school where he started the 2014-15 academic year had a single teacher assigned to 44 third graders. Hurd was virtually alone in trying to deal with the fact that her boy, then 8, could write only the first 2 letters of his name. Hurd says she was one of the parents Detroit public schools turned to when it needed a strong family showing at a rally or community members to serve on a task force. She was running for the Detroit School Board, but when she needed help, she had nowhere to run. Here I was, this advocate for education, and I couldn't find a place for my son. She says, I was crying in the principal's office, and I said, I don't know what to do. The principal said, I don't either. The scope of the problems plaguing Detroit schools, both traditional schools and charters, is almost unfathomable. According to the most recent National Assessment of Education Progress, only 4% of Detroit's eighth grade students can read and perform math at grade level, the lowest rate among the nation's big cities. Schools aren't located where families need them, and campuses, think about this, campuses often open and close with no coordination or notice. Over the last 6 years, most schools in the city have either opened or closed or both. In one neighborhood in the city's southwest quadrant, home to a large Latino population and a number of industrial zones, a dozen schools opened or closed in the span of 18 months. And when a parent shows up to find a child's classroom abandoned, good luck finding a new one. There are more than 200 schools with roughly 50 different enrollment processes and almost no standard for performance. Some 44% of the Detroit students are enrolled in charter schools, the second highest rate in the nation behind New Orleans. One of those schools is the Detroit Leadership Academy, which 2 years ago was solidly at the back of a flagging pack, abutting a crumbling freeway access road in the city's working-class Castle Rouge neighborhood. Several grades at the school's elementary campuses did not boast a single student reading or performing math at grade level. During the summer of 2015, a network of 3 charter schools called Equity Education Solutions, which unlike most of the city's charter operators is a nonprofit, was tasked with turning the school around. A restart required under law because of the consistently poor performance. Central Michigan University, the authorizing entity that granted the school permission to exist, told the fledgling network it had 8 months to fix things. In reality, the operators of Detroit charter schools almost never close them because of poor academic performance. So even a school where no child is achieving at grade level, can continue enrolling new students. That's school choice for you. That's the charter school movement for you. Not in every instance, but this is how it manifested itself in the state of Michigan, where Betsy DeVos played a major role. And the higher education institutions that authorize them often have financial incentives to keep the schools open. Charter networks often give the authorizers a percentage of the funding. So the agency, which is often a university or some other institution, actually gets a cut of the revenue for authorized. So they have a problem saying this charter must be shut down because that costs them money. In some states, in exchange for that revenue, charter authorizers are encouraged to provide support and accountability, but not in Michigan, where the trustees of the college doing the authorizing are appointed by the governor. Not even the governor has the authority to shut down chronically low-performing charter authorizers in Michigan. Education Trust Education Trust Midwest noted in a report released last week. Quote, despite the fact that such authorizers serve nearly 145,000 Michigan children and their charter schools take in more than $1 billion annually. Critics say this is especially problematic because almost all of Detroit charter schools are run by for-profit companies. Think about that. This is public education, right? These are public dollars. And suddenly they're going to for-profit companies. And it would be one thing, the old saw from members on the other side of the aisle, say, we should run government like a business. Well, if the point is to run things efficiently, to do more innovation, fine. If the point is to try to suck as much revenue out of the taxpayer as we possibly can and deliver a minimal service, I don't think we should run the public education system like that kind of a business. And in this case, it's not running it like a business, it is running a business with federal and state tax dollars. These private businesses aren't required to disclose their earnings, but a 2014 investigation by the Detroit Free Press suggests their profits are enormous. During the 12-13 school year, the paper found traditional Detroit public schools spent an average of about $7,000 per student in the classroom. Charter schools spent about $2,000 less per pupil. They're getting the same amount of money, they're spending $2,000 less per kid, yet spent double that rate on per pupil funding on administrative costs. That's their skim. That's their profit. Meanwhile, the oversupply of seats in for-profit schools has arguably kept nonprofit charter networks with better track records off the market. So they really are operating like a business. They're operating like an airline, right? They're operating like a credit card company, a financial services company. I mean, this is a private sector at work in public education. There are some private sector models where I think, hey, let's have a partnership with the Department of Education to try to see how much clean energy we can develop. Let's work with the Department of Commerce on export promotion. But there are some aspects of what the government does that are not a good fit with the private sector. And this is one of them. And this isn't some ideological test. It's just not working. We're ripping off our taxpayers and we're giving a bad value to the students who deserve better. The Senate bill under consideration at the Michigan State House would have created a Detroit commission with the power to change all of that. The leaders of the Michigan Association of Public School Academies, the Maine Charter Lobby Association, and some of Michigan's for-profit management companies have long lobbied against policies that would have tightened accountability. The most influential of them is Betsy DeVos, major player in Michigan's Republican Party and in the efforts to widen the for-profit sector. They've argued that the proposals such as that put forward by the Senate disregard the needs of Detroit's students. Legislators should not give in to this anti-choice, this is a quote from Ms. DeVos. Legislators should not give in to this anti-choice, anti-parent, and anti-student agenda aimed at protecting and maintaining the status quo for deeply entrenched adult interest groups, Betsy DeVos opined in the Detroit News. Quote, after all, since DPS has lost 75% of their enrollment in the past decade, haven't Detroit parents already voted resoundingly by fleeing for higher quality and safer schools elsewhere? But critics, including Stephen Henderson, the Detroit Free Press's editorial page editor, says it's groups such as the DeVos Foundations that have an agenda. House Republicans, for instance, are also standing in the way of a bill which would quite simply slow the spread of mediocre or failing schools. The article ends with a few paragraphs about Alyssa Hurd, the advocate described in the beginning of the story. After enrolling her son in 2 more schools that didn't work, she found a small startup school that has strategies for helping Judah compensate for his ADHD. He had to repeat the 3rd grade, but has rocketed ahead. Now he talks about becoming a scientist. The realization that better is possible has redoubled Hurd's willingness to make the trek to Lansing as often as parents' voices need to be heard. Quote, who are these people who are making the decisions and why aren't they in the schools? Why can't we know? Why can't you just be accountable to the people that you are serving? Now, during the confirmation hearing, Senator Bennett whom I greatly admire, who is a former superintendent of the Denver Public School District, asked Mrs. DeVos how the policy failures in Detroit might inform her leadership at the DOE. She replied, "I think there is a lot that has gone right." Senator Patty Murray, a former school board president, asked if Mrs. DeVos would promise not to privatize public education or cut funding. Pretty straightforward question. Pretty mainstream question, right? I mean, if you get you're sort of a mainstream Republican nominee for Secretary of Education, they know how to answer this question. They may be, they may have a different view of Common Core. They may have a different view of the teachers' unions. They may have a different view on charters and school choice. But everybody knows it's the third rail. You do not talk about privatizing public education. But here's her response. "I look forward, if confirmed, to working with you to talk about how we address the needs of all parents and all students. We acknowledge today that not all schools are working for the students that are assigned to them. I'm hopeful that we can work together to find common ground and ways that we can solve those issues and empower parents to make choices on behalf of their children that are right for them." I don't know what that means. It's not a complicated question, right? I mean, there are, certainly in the United States Senate, you get a lot of complicated questions, right? On the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Education Committee. I happen to be the ranking member of the Telecommunications Subcommittee on the Commerce Committee, and half of what I say is totally unintelligible to people who don't work in tech and telecom. But this is a very straightforward question. The question is, do you promise not to work on privatizing public education? And the answer is basically no, I don't promise. I mean, it's a word salad, but it doesn't mean anything. And she was given a very easy opportunity to disavow her intent to privatize public education. Privatization is not the answer. We should not be funneling taxpayer money into unregulated and unaccountable private schools. We need to champion access to public education and the accountability measures that give all of our students a chance to succeed. But in Michigan, Mrs. DeVos lobbied to block accountability standards for charter schools and lift the cap on charter schools. These actions push the number of unregulated, for-profit operators of charter schools from 255 to 805. Now, this doesn't mean that charter schools are the boogeyman here, right? I mean, there may be some disagreements between people who support charters and people who support traditional public schools, but at the end of the day, the legitimate mainstream charter school proponents will always want to be able to look you in the eye and say, look, this is not about vouchers, this is not about privatization, this is about the flexibility to innovate. They understand that the basic bargain in the charter movement has to be, okay, it's public education dollars, and there are a couple of things that are mandatory, right? You got to comply with federal and state law. You got to be subject to the same accountability standards, and you have to take all comers. And so it's very important to the mainstream charter people. I mean, I was interested to know, because I have a good relationship with education reformers and with the charter movement. And so I was interested when I heard about Mrs. DeVos, I was interested to hear what they had to say. And they were, in a lot of ways, more alarmed than anyone, because they believe that this will be the death knell for real charters. Because to the extent that charters are just cover for privatizing public education, well, now it's going to be a fight. Now it's going to be a fight. We have great charter schools in my home state of Hawaii. They're doing innovative things for their students, and that's something that we should all support. But when Mrs. DeVos talks about charter schools, she's not talking about those schools. She's talking about privatization. The rallying cry behind privatization is often school choice. But choice doesn't work as a practical matter in many places across the country. In a lot of communities, particularly in rural areas, school choice is not a practical response to the problems. There is no school down the road, right? There's no little Catholic school. There's no private charter school. There's no public charter school. There's just the school, right? Because the town is too small to have multiple options. And so when you talk about taking, and I heard a figure, $20 billion out of the K through 12 budget, which is not that, I mean, it's $20 billion out of $36 billion, and providing it for school choice and for charters, well, what about Alaska, right? What about Nebraska? What about the Dakotas? What about parts of Hawaii where if you give a if you give a parent and a student a voucher, and they say, well, I have this voucher for private education or charter schools, and yet there's only one school left, and all you did was eviscerate the budget of the only school in your neighborhood. That's how this is going to work as a practical matter. I don't know if that's the intent or not. I honestly don't know if that's the intent or not. But that's how it would end up working. To drain money from traditional public education hurts people in small communities, in rural communities, in places where there is no possibility of multiple schools. School choice can drain resources. If a charter school opens up, the public school has to divert resources from its students. And that's something I've heard about from people in Hawaii. One teacher who I heard from, who has worked for 2 decades in both Hawaii and Michigan, wrote this to me. Mrs. DeVos would be a disaster for public education. She has never been a teacher to know what current educational practices consist of. Her advocacy for more accountability, quote, often for-profit charter schools, her advocacy for more unaccountable, often for-profit charter schools and greater use of vouchers so that students could attend private or religious schools would take needed resources away from local public schools. Her mission, in short, is to privatize public education. I've witnessed firsthand in Michigan what happens when schools privatized. DeVos should not only be opposed for what she could do, if confirmed, but for what she has done in Michigan. The DeVos family set up the Great Lakes Education Project, which has played a leading role in thwarting efforts to regulate charter schools in Detroit and, for the most part, failed to deliver on their promises of a better education system for students. I just want to pause for a moment and thank all of the people who write my office every day, but in particular the people who have been writing my office on all of these nominees, because, you know, it wasn't that difficult to pull these incredibly insightful, passionate, individually written letters. And this is happening across the country. And, you know, you get the pundits, as you leave the Senate, if it's the middle of the day and not 2:30 in the morning, you kind of get, the media kind of comes to you and they stick the microphone in your face and they ask you about is there a new Tea Party on the left? All I can tell you is there are millions and millions and millions of people who are rising up. I don't think they're all on the left. I mean, when I saw those marches, there were lots of progressives, lots of people who believe in liberal and progressive causes. But I also saw some people who have never marched in their lives. I also saw some people who just care about public education. They don't even know what their politics are, except they saw Betsy DeVos and they said, no, this is not what I voted for. This is not what I want for my son or for my daughter or for my niece or my nephew. This is not what I want for the country's future. Which brings me to the second policy area that I think we ought to consider, and that is for-profit colleges. What is happening with some for-profit colleges is nothing less than a national scandal. Students are being hurt, and we are wasting tens of billions of dollars. So here are the facts. Almost 2 million students are enrolled in for-profit programs, and they have collectively taken on $200 billion in debt to attend. But they often leave with little to show for it. More than half drop out within a few months. And at some colleges, fewer than 5% of their students ever graduate. For those who leave without a degree, repaying loans is an incredible struggle. Students at for-profit colleges default on student loans at double the rate of students at nonprofit colleges. This is morally outrageous on its own, but it's particularly egregious to the American taxpayer because these substandard programs are financed almost entirely by the federal government, and the amount is staggering. In total, for-profits receive over $32 billion a year in federal financial aid. That's 20% of the total aid, and they serve 12% of the students. 20% of the aid, 12% of the students, $32 billion in federal funding. There are several for-profit companies that each take in more than $1 billion a year and graduate fewer than 10% of their students. Think about that. We, taxpayers, are paying most of the bill here, and these kids are not graduating. They take in more than $1 billion and yet graduate fewer than 10% of their kids. Not only are the education metrics on student performance awful, but many of these for-profit colleges are also under investigation for fraud and deception. Essentially, they've been lying to students and to state and federal agencies to cover up how bad their record is. Even while prosecutors go after these schools for fraud, they remain accredited and they continue to rake in federal funds. Here are a few examples. Education Management Corporation faces charges of fraud and deception brought by prosecutors in 13 states and the Department of Justice, and was facing a lawsuit to recover $11 billion in federal and state funds. And yet EMC is still accredited and still received $1.25 billion from the U.S. DOE last year. Ultimately, the Department of Justice secured a $100 million settlement, and a separate coalition of state attorneys general reached another settlement for $102 million in student loan debt relief for former students. ITT Educational Services was investigated and sued by 19 states, the SEC, the CFPB, and the DOJ. It's also under scrutiny from U.S. DOE for failure to meet financial responsibility standards. They remained accredited until the day they shut their doors. Think about that. They're still accredited by the U.S. DOE, right, until they're shut down by the U.S. DOJ. The year before, they received just under $600 million. Their closure left thousands of students left in the lurch with hundreds of thousands of dollars in student debt. Another 152 schools are under investigation by a working group of 37 state attorneys general. They too are still accredited. Collectively, they received $8 billion in federal financial aid last year. So what do these schools have in common? They never lose their accreditation, even when there are ongoing investigations of fraud and deceptive practices that harm students. And accreditation is the key to the castle for accessing the spigot of federal financial aid. It is supposed to signify that a program provides a quality education for its students. But here's the thing. This accreditation doesn't mean much. The Government Accountability Office released a study on accreditation in 2014, and its findings were shocking. Over a 4-year period, the GAO found that accreditors sanctioned only 8% of the institutions they oversaw and revoked accreditation for just 1%. They revoked accreditation for just 1%. So 99% of them, even if there's something wrong, they keep those federal funds flowing in. Even more troubling, GAO found that there was no correlation between accreditor sanctions and educational quality. In other words, schools with bad student outcomes were no more likely to be sanctioned by their accreditor than schools with good student outcomes. Our accreditation system is totally broken. According to the Higher Education Act, accreditation agencies are supposed to be the reliable authorities as to the quality of education or training offered by institutions of higher education. That's the reason for making accreditation a core criteria for receiving federal funds. How are we following the law when accreditation reviews find that 99% of these institutions are providing an education of value? How can we say with a straight face that accreditors are acting as reliable authorities on educational quality? And here's the problem: money. Incentives are lined up against being critical and against setting high standards. The problem can be traced back to the funding and the governance of the accreditation agencies themselves. First, the accreditation agencies are funded by the same institutions that they accredit. Colleges pay an initial fee to become accredited and annual dues after that. They pay for site visits and other services. Second, accrediting agencies are run by and overseen by the institutions that they accredit. The member institutions elect their own academics and administrators to serve on the board of the accreditation agency. So everyone's in on it, right? Everyone makes money pretending that this is fine. We have a system that is dysfunctional, if not corrupt, in which it is far too easy to become and remain accredited. And this is a very, very similar system to what we had with S&P and Moody's and all of these rating agencies that had financial incentives to determine that all of these derivatives and credit default swaps and crazy financial instruments that were clearly not creditworthy were getting AAA ratings. Why? Because the financial incentives over time had enmeshed the accreditors with the accredited. And this is supposed to be a sort of independent relationship because they're supposed to be certifying to the consumer that everything is all good, right? And what happened? The system came crashing down. Now, I don't think the system will come crashing down, except that the system is already coming crashing down on the students who are getting ripped off. You have schools that are taking more than $1 billion of federal funds in. Several schools, every year, federal funds in excess of $1 billion, and 5% of the kids are graduating. For the sake of students and taxpayers, the department has to make this a top priority, but I am not convinced that Mrs. DeVos will do that. She has no experience in higher education, a fact that does not bode well for the 6,000 colleges and universities in this country. And when Senator Warren questioned her about this in her confirmation hearing, her response was concerning. Here's the transcript. Senator Warren, how do you plan to protect taxpayer dollars from waste, fraud, and abuse from colleges that take in millions of dollars in federal student aid? Senator, if confirmed, I will certainly be very vigilant. How? Senator Warren, how? How are you going to do that? You said you are committed. Mrs. DeVos, the individuals with whom I work in the department will ensure that federal monies are used properly and appropriately. Senator Warren, you are going to subcontract making sure that what happens with universities that cheat students doesn't happen anymore? You're going to give that to someone else to do? I just want to know what your ideas are. Mrs. DeVos, I want to make sure we don't have problems with that as well. If confirmed, I will work diligently to ensure that we are addressing any of those issues. Senator Warren, well, let me make a suggestion on this. It actually turns out that there are a whole group of rules that are already written and are there, and all you have to do is enforce them. What I want to know is, will you commit to enforcing these rules? Mrs. DeVos, Senator, I will commit to ensuring that institutions which receive federal funds are actually serving their students well. So will you enforce the gainful employment rule to make sure that these career colleges are not cheating students? We will certainly review that rule. And again, this goes back to somebody who is kind of walking into a hearing saying, look, I got the votes. I don't have to learn about public education. I don't have to listen to Democrats' concerns. I don't have to listen to teachers' concerns or students' concerns or experts in education concerns. I don't have to learn about higher education, which is, by money spent like 3/4 of the United States Department of Education. Mrs. Warren, you will review it. You will not commit to enforce it. Mrs. DeVos, and see that it is actually achieving what the intentions are. Mrs. Warren, I don't understand about reviewing it. We talked about this in my office. There are already rules in place and so on. Senator Warren's exchange there is very revealing. I know that Republicans care very deeply about the fight against waste, fraud, and abuse. I hear it all the time, and I hope they will consider this nominee's tepid commitment to this issue as they talk with their constituents about how they're going to vote. The third issue I'm concerned about is college affordability. The rising cost of college is one of the biggest middle-class issues of our time, if it's not the biggest issue of our time. No generation escapes this problem. If you're a student or a parent, you worry about paying for college. And I know plenty of grandparents who are worried about their children who are still paying off their own college loans and now trying to save up for their student. The federal government is giving $140 billion in federal aid to institutions of higher learning in grants and loans. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. That's federal policy. We've decided we want to make college affordable because higher education is the straightest line to develop the workforce we need and for people to move up the economic ladder. But with that $140 billion, we need to be making college more affordable. And we're actually getting the opposite result. We are spending more, both in raw dollars and in inflation-adjusted dollars, than ever in federal financial aid and grants, and yet the cost of college keeps going up and up and up. Average Pell Grant awards have increased by almost 20% in the past 10 years. In the same period, Pell Grants covered 25% less of the average public school's tuition and fees. We are officially paying more and getting less. This is because college costs are growing faster than the cost of all other consumer goods, twice as fast as healthcare costs. It is impossible to get ahead nowadays without a college degree, but the growing cost of college is preventing some from getting a degree in the first place and leaving others with unmanageable levels of debt. It's clear that our system isn't working. If we're subsidizing higher education with federal dollars, we have a responsibility to incentivize institutions of higher education to become more affordable, provide access to low-income students, and deliver quality education. We want to reward those schools that are focused on affordability and give incentives for the rest to make affordability part of their mission. But based on Mrs. DeVos' testimony, it's unclear whether or not she agrees. In 2011, the Department of Education sent colleges and universities a letter that made clear that sexual assault is prohibited under Title IX. It advised school officials to be responsive to reports of sexual violence and gave guidelines on how schools should process those reports. But during Mrs. DeVos' hearing, she had an exchange with Senator Casey that indicates that she could roll back this progress. Let's take a look at the transcript. Would you agree with me that the problem, and that's an understatement in my judgment, that the problem of sexual assault on campus is a significant one that we should take action on? Senator, thank you for that question. I agree with you that sexual assault in any form or in any place is a problem. I ask you, would you uphold the 2011 Title IX guidance as it relates to sexual assault on campus? Senator, I know there's a lot of conflicting ideas and opinions around that guidance, and if confirmed, I would work with you, and so on. So, my concern about Mrs. DeVos go to policy, they go to preparation, but most of all, they go to a basic understanding of what public education is about. They go to a basic commitment to the mission of public education. Every senator's office is ringing off the hook with people telling us that Mrs. DeVos is not the right choice. And so to my Republican colleagues, you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take the word of the other 49 senators who know that Mrs. DeVos will not be the leader of the Department of Education that we all need. You only have to take the word of the people in your own state and the groups that we look to and trust when it comes to our country's education system. These are the people that we are here to serve. They are the parents, the grandparents, the teachers, the faculty, the school board members, and the students who count on us to make the right decisions. We may not agree on who would make the perfect Secretary of Education, but we can agree that people from across the country are speaking out against Mrs. DeVos, and it's up to us to listen. I will be voting no on her nomination, and I ask Republicans to follow the advice of their constituents and join me. I yield the floor.
Call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.